1895, Texas. First Communion Macabre history. The family who hid more than prayers. The dust of West Texas clung to everything, a fine ochre-colored shroud that settled on the clapboard houses, the parched mesquite trees, and the weary faces of the townsfolk of Harmony Creek. It was the summer of 1895, a season of unforgiving sun and whispered grievances. For Silas Abernathy, a man whose hands were as calloused as the land he worked, the dust was more than an inconvenience. It was a constant, gritty reminder of his lot in life. He had spent his entire 25 years bound to this soil, to the rhythmic toil of the farm, and to the quiet, suffocating piety of his family. Today, the silence was different. It wasn't the peaceful hush of a Sunday morning, but the heavy, expectant quiet that precedes a storm. The cause was simple, yet momentous. His younger sister, Elara, was to receive her first communion. At 15, she was a wisp of a girl, pale and fragile, her eyes holding a depth of fear that had nothing to do with God. Silas had seen it, a flicker of genuine terror, when their mother had helped her into the stiff, starched white dress that morning. A stark, unadorned garment that seemed to press the very life out of her. The Abernathy family was a pillar of the community, or so they presented themselves. His father, Elias, was a man of the word, his voice a deep, resonant rumble that could command a congregation or silence a dinner table. His mother, Rebecca, was a silent force, her faith a shield she held up against the world and against her own children. Silas and his elder brother Thomas had been raised in a home where prayer was the first act of the day and the last, and where the slightest transgression was met not with a raised voice, but with a cold, cutting disappointment that felt far worse than any punishment. Thomas, 3 years Silas's senior, was the golden son. He possessed his father's charisma and his mother's unwavering piety. He had left Harmony Creek 2 years prior to study for the ministry in a larger city, and his return for Elara's communion was seen by the family as a divine blessing. Silas, by contrast, was the shadow, the son who preferred the company of the fields to the confines of the church, whose faith was a question mark rather than a foundation. He watched from the porch as the family gathered, the sun glinting off the polished black leather of their shoes. Thomas, in a dark suit, stood tall beside their father, a confident smile on his face. Rebecca straightened Elara's dress with hands that trembled ever so slightly. Elara's gaze, however, was fixed on Silas. A silent plea passed between them, a shared understanding forged in years of silent resistance. He saw the same thing in her eyes he had felt in his own heart for so long, a desperate need to break free. The church bell began to toll, a slow, mournful sound that carried on the hot, still air. "It's time," Elias said, his voice a command. Silas followed them, his boots kicking up a small cloud of dust with each step. The walk to the church was short, but it felt endless. He was hyper-aware of the stares from neighbors, of the knowing nods that passed between the women who stood on their own porches. The Abernathy family was a subject of much speculation in Harmony Creek, their devotion a source of both admiration and quiet unease. It was the kind of unease that the townsfolk couldn't quite put their finger on, a feeling that something was being hidden beneath the polished veneer of their perfect lives. Inside the church, the air was heavy with the scent of old wood and beeswax. The pews were filled with familiar faces, the weathered farmers, the women in their Sunday best, the children with scrubbed faces and wide, curious eyes. Silas took his place beside Thomas in the front pew, the two brothers a study in contrast. One, the future of the church, the other, a constant, unspoken question. The service began, and Silas's mind began to wander. He thought of the cellar back home, of the heavy padlock his father had put on the door years ago. He thought of the strange sounds he sometimes heard late at night, a faint scraping or a low moan that the wind could not explain. He had always dismissed them, blaming his overactive imagination or the creaks and groans of an old house. But today, with Elara's terrified eyes burned into his memory, the sound seemed to take on a new and sinister meaning. He looked at Elara, kneeling at the altar, her hands clasped tightly. Her small body was rigid, her face ashen. The priest spoke of faith and salvation, of the body and blood of Christ. But when Elara opened her mouth to receive the wafer, her hand shook so violently that she nearly dropped it. A gasp rippled through the congregation. Rebecca's face tightened into a mask of steel. Elias, however, remained impassive, a rock of unshakable faith. When the service ended, the townsfolk poured out of the church, their faces a mix of concern and gossip. Silas heard a woman whisper to her husband, "Poor Elara. She looks like she's seen a ghost." He knew the truth was far more terrifying than any phantom. Back at the house, a celebratory feast had been laid out, but the celebratory mood was non-existent. A tense silence hung over the dinner table. Elara picked at her food, her eyes downcast. Elias spoke of Thomas's progress, of the great work he would do for the Lord. Thomas spoke of his studies, of the theological debates that consumed his days. Silas remained quiet, his thoughts consumed by the cellar, by Elara's fear, and by a sense of foreboding that grew stronger with every passing minute. Later that evening, as the last rays of sun bled across the horizon, Silas found Elara sitting alone on the porch swing, her white dress a ghostly shape in the fading light. He sat beside her, the swing creaking softly. "Are you all right, Elara?" he asked, his voice low. She didn't answer at first. She just stared out at the fields, at the endless expanse of dusty earth. Then she turned to him, her eyes wide and full of tears. "Silas," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "You have to help me. I can't do this anymore. You don't know what they do. You don't know what they keep in the cellar." The words hung in the air, a final, horrifying confirmation of his darkest fears. The simple, unadorned First Communion dress, the silent fear, the locked cellar door. It wasn't about God. It was about something else, something dark and buried, hidden beneath 100 years of dust and the pious façade of the Abernathy family. The macabre history of the family was about to be unearthed, and Silas knew with a chilling certainty that it would change their lives forever. Silas's heart hammered against his ribs, a frantic drum against the suffocating silence of the evening. Elara's words, "You don't know what they keep in the cellar," had shattered the fragile peace of their world. He looked at his sister, a small figure trembling in the twilight, and the terrified vulnerability in her eyes was a more profound truth than any sermon. The Abernathy family's carefully constructed facade of piety was now revealed to be a prison, with Elara as its most fragile captive. "What do you mean, Elara? What's in the cellar?" he asked, his voice a low, urgent whisper. She shook her head, tears tracing clean paths through the dust on her cheeks. "I can't tell you. Not here. Not now. They'll hear." She glanced towards the darkened windows of the house, a gesture of ingrained fear that spoke volumes. "Wait until everyone is asleep. Meet me at the cellar door." He nodded, a chill spreading through him despite the lingering heat of the day. The porch swing creaked once more as he pushed himself up, his mind racing. He knew their parents' nocturnal habits. Rebecca would read her Bible by the lamplight for a while before retiring, while Elias would stay up even later, preparing his sermons in the study, a room where the air always felt thick with unspoken judgment. Thomas, however, was the wild card. His brother's return had added a layer of complexity to their already tense household. The hours that followed were an agonizing crawl. Silas sat in his room, the sounds of the house a symphony of paranoia. The rustle of paper from his father's study, the soft footsteps in the hallway, the distant muffled sound of his mother's prayers. Every creak of the floorboards felt like a threat, every shadow a potential witness. He thought back to his childhood, to the moments of inexplicable terror he had witnessed in Elara, the nightmares that would wake her with a silent scream, the sudden frantic way she would pull her sleeve down to cover a wrist or an arm, the way she would flinch whenever their father's hand came near her. He had always dismissed it as a child's overactive imagination, a byproduct of a strict and emotionally distant home. Now, a cold, sickening clarity settled over him. It wasn't imagination. It was fear. When he judged the house to be finally, utterly silent, he slipped out of his room. The floorboards beneath his bare feet were cold against his skin, each step a deliberate, controlled movement. He passed his parents' bedroom, the soft murmur of their breathing audible through the closed door. He paused at Thomas's door, which was ajar, a sliver of darkness where his brother slept. Silas held his breath, waiting for any sign of movement, but there was none. He crept down the back stairs, the air growing colder as he approached the cellar door. It was tucked away in a small, forgotten pantry, a heavy wooden slab of a door with an iron padlock, a recent addition in the past few months. He found Elara waiting for him, a small, hunched figure huddled in the shadows. She held a flickering candle, the small flame casting long, dancing shadows on the walls. "The key," Silas whispered. "Where is it?" Elara shook her head. "Father keeps it. On his belt even when he sleeps." Her voice was a terrified tremor. "But I know how we can get in. He keeps a spare. A copy. For emergencies." She led him out into the inky blackness of the yard. The Texas night was a suffocating blanket, thick with the scent of dry earth and sagebrush. They moved through the darkness towards the old shed at the back of the property, a derelict structure used for storing old farm equipment and other forgotten things. Elara pointed to a loose stone in the foundation, a small rock she could easily remove with her hands. "He hid it there," she whispered, her eyes fixed on the house. "I saw him once." Silas knelt, his fingers fumbling in the dirt and crumbling mortar. He felt a small, cold piece of metal, a key. He pulled it out, its shape and weight familiar in his hand. He looked at Elara, her face a pale oval in the candlelight, and felt a surge of protectiveness mixed with a bone-deep dread. They returned to the pantry, the key cold and heavy in his palm. The padlock looked solid, its iron surface scarred by time. He fumbled with the key, his hands shaking slightly, and finally, with a soft click, the lock sprang open. The sound was deafening in the quiet house, a single sharp noise that seemed to echo for an eternity. Elara pushed the door open, a rush of cold, musty air escaping from the darkness below. The scent was a nauseating mix of damp earth, mildew, and something else, something metallic and sickly sweet. Silas held the candle high, its weak light barely penetrating the blackness of the stairwell. "Stay here," he whispered, a sudden urgent need to protect her taking over. "I'll go first." She clung to his sleeve, her grip surprisingly strong. "No, you can't go alone. I have to show you." He didn't argue. They descended into the cellar, the wooden steps groaning under their combined weight. The air grew colder, and the strange metallic smell grew stronger, assaulting his senses. The light from the candle danced on the walls, revealing nothing but stacked crates and old cobweb-covered furniture. It seemed to be a normal cellar, the kind every farm had for storing root vegetables and preserves. But Elara's terror told him otherwise. She led him to the far corner of the cellar, to a section that was partitioned off by a makeshift wall of old planks. The planks were not new. They were weathered and stained, as if they had been there for a very long time. Silas could see the gaps between the boards, and he held the candle up to one of the wider cracks. He saw it then, a small, dark room, the air within it thick with shadows. He couldn't make out any details at first, just a jumble of forms and shapes. And then he saw the small child-sized cot, and a figure, a small huddled figure lying on it covered by a thin, dirty blanket. A sound, a low, guttural moan escaped from the room. It was not a sound a child would make. It was the sound of something broken, something suffering. Silas dropped the candle. It hit the dirt floor with a soft thud, the flames sputtering and then dying, plunging them into utter darkness. A suffocating blackness, filled with the horrifying realization that the monsters were not ghosts or demons, but the very family he had been taught to revere. The sudden darkness was a physical blow, a void that swallowed the meager light and left Silas and Elara suspended in a terrifying blindness. The guttural sound, however, remained, a chilling echo in the suffocating black. Elara's hand shot out, her fingers digging into his arm with an iron grip. Her silent panic was more potent than any scream. Silas's mind, for a brief moment, went blank. The image of the small cot, the huddled figure, the inhuman sound, it all coalesced into a single, horrifying truth that he could not yet comprehend. His senses, however, were not so easily silenced. He could feel the cold, damp earth beneath his feet, and he could smell the cloying, metallic scent that was now sickeningly familiar. "A match," he whispered, his voice trembling. "Elara, do you have a match?" She was fumbling in her pockets, her body shaking. No, I didn't. He felt a sudden, urgent need to get back to the small crack in the wall, to see again, to confirm the truth of what he had just witnessed. He groped along the wall, his hands brushing against the rough, splintered wood of the partitions. The sound came again, a bit louder this time, a ragged breath followed by a low moan that was filled with an unspeakable pain. Silas found the crack again, his fingers tracing the rough edge of a plank. He leaned in, his face close to the opening, his breath coming in short, shallow gasps. The darkness was absolute. He couldn't see anything. He had to have light. "Stay here," he whispered to Elara, pulling away from her. "I'm going to get a lamp. I have to see." He turned and began to ascend the stairs, each creak a loud accusation in the oppressive silence. He could feel Elara's terror radiating behind him, but he couldn't wait. He needed to know. He had to know. The image of his parents, his father's resonant voice and his mother's silent piety, was now overlaid with the vision of the dark room and the suffering within. He reached the top of the stairs and slipped back into the pantry, the air warmer and cleaner than the cellar's stale, putrid atmosphere. He crept through the darkened house, his footsteps a ghost on the floorboards, until he reached the kitchen. A single lantern sat on the countertop, the wick ready to be lit. He grabbed a box of matches from a nearby shelf, the small wooden box feeling like a lifeline. He struck one, the sudden flare of light a welcome comfort in the all-encompassing dark. He lit the lantern, the soft golden light pushing back the shadows. And then, with the lantern in hand, he hurried back to the cellar door. Elara was still there, a small, huddled form, her eyes wide with fear. She hadn't moved. "I have to go down there," Silas said, his voice firm, no longer a whisper. "I have to know what's happening." She didn't argue. She just followed him down the stairs, the lantern's glow illuminating the scene. The cellar looked the same, but the air felt different. The metallic scent was now a tangible presence, a foul taste on his tongue. He held the lantern up to the partition wall, and this time he was ready for what he would see. He held the lantern to a gap between the planks, the light from the flames spilling into the small, confined space. The room was not empty. It was a crude, makeshift prison. The walls were nothing but rough, unplastered earth. The floor was packed dirt. In the corner, there was a bucket. And on the cot, a small figure. It was a boy. a child no older than 10 or 11. His limbs were gaunt, his skin a sallow, unhealthy color. His hair was long and matted, and his face was obscured by the shadows. He was chained at the ankle to the iron leg of the cot, a heavy chain that looked far too large for his small frame. The source of the sound was his breathing, a ragged, labored rasp that ended in a low, pained moan. Silas's breath hitched. He wanted to scream, to cry out in protest, but the sound was trapped in his throat, a tight, burning lump. 1,000 questions swirled in his mind, each one more horrifying than the last. Who was this boy? How did he get here? Why was he chained? He looked at Elara, whose face was a mixture of grief and terror. She was looking at the boy, her eyes filled with a heartbreaking pity. "Who is he, Elara?" Silas whispered. Is he our brother?" She shook her head, a slow, mournful movement. "No, not our brother." She paused, her eyes welling up with tears. His name is Samuel. He's been here for 4 years, since he was a little boy, father and mother. They brought him home and they put him in here." Silas felt his knees buckle. 4 years. A child, held captive in their cellar for 4 years. The perfectly pious, God-fearing Abernathy family had a secret so monstrous, so depraved, that it defied all comprehension. "But why?" he asked, his voice raw with disbelief. "Why would they do this?" Elara's voice was a whisper, a thread of sound in the silence. "He's not a normal boy. He came from a traveling family, a group of outcasts. Father said he was an abomination, that he was born with sin, with a darkness that could corrupt others. He said he was saving the town. He was saving us." Silas stared at the boy. There was no sign of what his father had called darkness. There was only a sick, suffering child, a victim of a twisted, fanatical ideology. He looked at the chain, at the gaunt face, and his disbelief turned to a cold, hard fury. He couldn't leave the boy here. He couldn't go back to his room and pretend this wasn't happening. He had to act. "We have to get him out," he said, his voice now firm, resolute. "We have to get him out of here." Elara looked at him, her eyes wide. "But how? The chains. And Father, he would never let us. He would do something terrible." Silas looked back at the boy, at the small, frail body chained to the cot. He thought of his own life, of the silent oppression he had endured, of the years he had lived in the shadow of his brother's perfection. He thought of his father's righteous pronouncements, of his mother's cold, silent judgment, and he knew, with a certainty that settled deep in his bones, that he could not, would not, live another day under their roof, knowing that a child was suffering beneath his feet. The Abernathy family's perfect image was a lie, built on a foundation of suffering, and he was going to tear it down, brick by painful brick. The plan, when they finally devised one, was reckless and fueled by a desperate need for justice. Silas knew they couldn't simply smash the padlock or the chains. The noise would bring their parents and Thomas down on them in an instant. They needed a way to get the boy out quietly, without a struggle, and with minimal risk of being discovered. "We need a key for the chains," Silas said, his mind racing, "and we need to get him out of the house without them knowing." Elara's mind, a quiet repository of her family's dark habits, provided the crucial details. "Father keeps a set of keys for all the locks on the farm. They're on a hook in his study. He keeps the study locked at night, but the door is old. The lock is a little loose. I've seen him jiggle it to get it to catch." This was a sliver of hope, a fragile path out of their nightmare. Silas's first instinct was to run, to go for the local sheriff in Harmony Creek. But his gut told him this was a mistake. His father was a man of immense influence in the town, a man of God. The sheriff, a devout man named Jedediah Cross, was a regular attendee at their church. Elias would simply spin a tale of a mad son and a confused daughter, and the truth, whatever it was, would be buried forever, with the boy likely relocated to a more remote and perhaps more brutal location. No, they had to free Samuel first, and then, with the boy as living proof, they could go to the authorities. The next day passed in a haze of feigned normalcy. Silas went about his chores, his mind a million miles away, replaying the horrifying scene in the cellar. He found himself unable to meet his parents' eyes. Every word his father spoke, every prayer his mother murmured, felt like a grotesque mockery. Thomas, however, was oblivious to the undercurrents. He spoke of his theological studies with an air of superiority, of his plans for a future in the ministry, and of the glory of God. Silas felt a cold, bitter resentment welling up inside him. Did Thomas know? Was he a part of this monstrous secret? Or was he truly as blind as he seemed? That evening, as dinner concluded, Silas caught a moment alone with Elara in the kitchen. "The study," he whispered, "tonight, when father is asleep." She nodded, a silent, grim pact passing between them. The night air was a relief after the oppressive silence of the house. Silas waited in his room, listening. The house fell silent around 10 o'clock, a hush broken only by the chirping of crickets outside. He waited another hour, and then another, to be absolutely sure. At midnight, he slipped out of his room. He found Elara waiting for him in the hallway, a dark shadow against the white walls. She carried a small, worn leather pouch. "I got this from the barn," she whispered, her voice barely a breath. "It has some food and water. We can't just let him starve." Silas felt a swell of pride for his sister. In this moment, she was no longer a fragile child. She was a partner in this desperate fight. They crept to Elias's study door. The room was at the back of the house, away from the bedrooms. Silas tested the doorknob. It was, as Elara had said, locked. He held his breath, but there was no sound from within. He pushed the key from the cellar into the lock, and with a gentle jiggle and a small twist, the lock clicked open. The sound was so quiet, so insignificant, that he almost missed it. They slipped inside, the air in the study heavy with the scent of old books and pipe tobacco. A single sliver of moonlight pierced through a gap in the curtains, illuminating a section of the wall where a hook held a jangling set of keys. Silas's heart pounded in his ears as he reached for them, his hand trembling slightly. He had never been in his father's study before. It was a sacred, forbidden space, a sanctuary for a man who believed himself to be a living saint. He had the keys in his hand when a sound from the hallway froze him in place. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate footsteps, coming down the hall. He looked at Elara, her eyes wide with terror. They couldn't hide. The room was too small, too bare. There was only one place to go. The back door, which led out into the yard. They flattened themselves against the wall, their bodies pressed together as they waited. The footsteps stopped outside the study door. A long, agonizing pause. Then the doorknob turned. The door opened, and a figure stood silhouetted in the moonlight. Thomas, the golden son, the perfect brother, the devout man of God. He knew. "You knew?" Silas asked, his voice thick with disbelief and a rising fury. "All this time? You've known?" Thomas moved to the desk, his hands resting on the smooth wood. "I didn't know until 2 years ago, when I came home from school for the summer. Father, he told me. He explained it all. The boy, the reason for his imprisonment." "What reason?" Elara asked, her voice trembling. What could possibly justify this? Silas's breath caught in his throat. Thomas didn't move, didn't say anything. He just stood there, a silent, imposing figure in the darkness. "Thomas," Elara whispered, her voice a small, terrified squeak. He stepped inside, closing the door behind him. He didn't light a lamp. He just stood there, a shadow among shadows. "I know," he said, his voice low, a chilling contrast to his usual booming, confident tone. "I know about the boy." Silas's world tilted on its axis. Thomas sighed, a long, weary sound. "Father believes the boy is a curse, a living embodiment of an evil that was meant to be eradicated, a perversion of God's plan." He paused, as if trying to find the right words. "He told me the boy came from a family of travelers, a group who held to a different, profane faith. He said they were a threat to the community, to our way of life. He said the boy was a vessel for their unholy beliefs, that he was born to corrupt and destroy." Silas's fury boiled over. "That's insane, Thomas. He's a child. He's sick, he's starving, he's chained in a cellar." Thomas turned to them, and in the moonlight, Silas could finally see his brother's face. It was not filled with malice or a righteous anger, but with a profound, bone-deep sorrow. "I know," he said, the words barely a whisper. "I have not slept a single full night since Father told me. I have prayed. I have begged God for a sign, for an answer. I have read every holy text, every sermon, every word. I have tried to understand my father's reasoning, to believe that this is an act of divine justice." He paused, his gaze meeting Silas's. "But I cannot. I cannot find a single passage, a single word that justifies the torment of a child." Silas was stunned into silence. This was not the Thomas he knew. This was a man burdened by a terrible secret, a man whose faith had been shattered by the truth. "Then help us," Silas said, the words a desperate plea. "Help us get him out. Help us prove what they've done." Thomas's eyes were filled with a terrible conflict. "I can't. Not yet. I have to be sure. I have to find a way to get proof that will convince the entire town, a boy in a cellar. Father will say he's insane, that he's a demon. The town will believe him." He looked at the keys in Silas's hand. "Give me the keys. I have a plan, a better one that will expose them for what they are." Silas didn't know what to do. His brother, the golden son, was standing before him, not as an accomplice, but as a shattered man who was also seeking justice. But his words were filled with a caution that Silas didn't have time for. A child was suffering. He looked at Elara, whose face was a blank mask of indecision. He had to make a choice, and he had to make it now. Silas's mind was a whirlwind of doubt and urgency. He stared at his brother, at the conflicted sorrow on his face, and for the first time he saw not the pious, perfect Thomas, but a man wrestling with a faith that had been poisoned by his own family. The logical, calculated part of Silas wanted to trust him. Thomas was more intelligent, more cunning. He had spent years studying not just faith, but the minds of men. He would know how to expose their parents without being dismissed as a madman. But the emotional, protective part of him, the part that had seen the fear in Elara's eyes and the suffering of the boy in the cellar, screamed that there was no time for a slow, methodical plan. A child was chained in a dungeon. Every passing minute was a minute of torment. "No," Silas said, the word coming out with a surprising firmness. "I can't wait, Thomas. He might not have much time. I have to get him out now." Thomas's face hardened, the sorrow giving way to a desperate frustration. "Silas, listen to me. You get him out, and you will be a fugitive. Father will paint you as a liar, a thief, a madman. You'll be disowned, and the boy will be forgotten. This is not a matter of a few hours. It's a matter of evidence, of truth, of a narrative that will convince the town that the Abernathy family, their pillars of faith, are monsters." He reached for the keys, but Silas pulled back. "I'm not doing this for the town. I'm doing this for him, for Elara, for us. We've lived with this lie for too long. A low groan came from the hallway, a sound that made all three of them freeze. It was the sound of a door opening. Footsteps. Not Thomas's. Slower, heavier. The footsteps of their father, Elias. Thomas's eyes widened. "He's coming," he whispered, a note of pure panic in his voice. "He must have heard us." Silas, with the keys in his hand, made a split-second decision. "Go," he hissed at Elara. "Go back to your room. Act like you were never here." She didn't hesitate. She was a master of silent escape, of disappearing into the shadows of their oppressive home. She was gone in a moment. Silas looked at Thomas, who was standing frozen, staring at the door. "Thomas," he said, his voice low and urgent. "What do we do?" His brother, the man who had a plan, looked completely lost. "The study door. I never relocked it." The doorknob of the study turned. The door swung open, and Elias Abernathy stood in the doorway, a lamp in his hand, his face a grim mask of a righteous fury. His eyes, cold and hard as stone, fell on Silas. "Silas," he said, his voice a low, terrifying rumble. "What are you doing in my study?" He was in his nightclothes, a simple white shirt and trousers, but he still looked like a titan, an immovable force of nature. His gaze shifted from Silas to the keys in his hand. "The keys," Elias said, his voice now a venomous hiss. "Why do you have my keys?" Silas's mind raced. He could lie. He could say he was just getting something, that he had a headache and couldn't sleep. But the keys were a damning piece of evidence. He knew, instinctively, that this was the end of the line. There was no going back to the way things were. He had to face his father, and he had to face him with the truth. "I know," Silas said, his voice surprisingly steady. "I know what you keep in the cellar. I know about the boy." Elias's face remained impassive. The only thing that changed was a subtle tightening around his eyes, a glint of something cold and dangerous. He looked at Thomas, whose face was a mask of fear and shame. "And you, Thomas," Elias said, his voice dripping with disappointment. "Have you also been swayed by this madness?" Thomas swallowed hard, his voice a dry, ragged rasp. "Father, please, you have to understand. What you've done, it's wrong. It's not the will of God." A cruel, terrible smile spread across Elias's face. "The will of God is not for you to question, boy. It is for you to obey. I was chosen for this burden, to protect this town from an ancient evil, and you, my son, were chosen to help me." "Help you?" Silas spat, the words a rush of pent-up anger. "By keeping a boy chained in a cage? By starving him and letting him rot? You call that help?" Elias took a step into the room, his shadow growing larger, more menacing. "He is not a boy, Silas. He is a vessel, a host. He was born with a darkness that would have consumed this entire community. I saved you. I saved your mother. I saved this town from a fate worse than death." Silas felt a wave of nausea. His father was not just a man with a secret. He was a fanatic, a zealot who believed his actions were not just justified, but sanctified. This was not a man who could be reasoned with. This was a man who had gone mad, a man who had created his own twisted version of faith to justify a monstrous act. "We're going to the sheriff," Silas said, his voice firm, resolute. "We're going to tell them everything." Elias laughed, a hollow, bitter sound that held no humor. "You will go to the sheriff? A sheriff who sits in my pews every Sunday? Who has broken bread in my house? He will not believe you. He will believe me. He will believe that my son, the one who has always strayed, has finally broken. He will believe I am right to have you committed to the asylum in the city, where you can find the salvation you so desperately need." The word asylum hung in the air, a final, horrifying threat. Elias's eyes, full of a chilling certainty, moved between his two sons. The pious son, the golden boy, a man of God who had finally found his conscience, and the wayward son, the one who had always questioned. A choice was being made, a final judgment passed. Elias had not just trapped a boy in his cellar, he had trapped his own family in a web of lies and madness. And Silas knew with a certainty that was both terrifying and liberating that his brother's plan, whatever it was their only hope. "Give me the keys, Silas," Thomas said, his voice low and urgent. He looked at his father, a strange, profound calm now on his face. "I have to do this. I have to find a different kind of salvation." Silas, with a final desperate look at his brother, handed him the keys. He didn't know what Thomas had planned. He only knew that for the first time in his life, he had chosen to trust his brother over his father. He had traded one form of faith for another. The air in Elias's study was thick with unspoken tension. The keys, now in Thomas's hand, felt less like a tool for escape and more like a final, desperate plea for a different kind of justice. Elias, however, remained motionless, his eyes fixed on Thomas with a chilling intensity. "You speak of salvation, Thomas," Elias said, his voice low and laced with a righteous contempt. "But I fear you have confused it with a weakness of spirit, a compassion for the profane. This is a test, a divine trial to see if you are worthy of the work I have chosen for you." Thomas's face, however, no longer held its earlier fear. A new expression had settled there, one of grim determination. He looked at his father, at the man he had revered his entire life, and saw only a stranger, a fanatic twisted by his own self-proclaimed divinity. "There is no divine trial here, Father," Thomas said, his voice steady. "There is only a crime, a terrible, unforgivable crime. You have taken a life you deemed unworthy, and you have broken every holy law in the name of your own twisted beliefs." Elias took a step closer, his eyes narrowing. "Watch your tongue, boy. You speak of things you do not understand. The boy is a corruption, a vessel of a family whose lineage is stained with an evil that cannot be reasoned with. I did not take a life. I contained a plague." "A plague? He's a child," Silas interjected, his voice trembling with fury. "He is no child of God," Elias roared, the sound echoing in the small room. He looked at Thomas, his gaze pleading. "Thomas, you of all people must see this. You have studied the word. You know of the darkness that walks the earth. This is a battle for our souls, for the soul of this town." Thomas, however, was no longer looking at his father. He was looking at the keys in his hand. He had a plan, a terrible, desperate one, and now it was a race against time. He had to get to the boy, but first he had to get his father out of the way. "Father," Thomas said, his voice now a quiet, dangerous calm, "I have something to show you. Something that will prove my devotion, my loyalty to your vision. It is something I brought back with me, something from my studies that will show you how deeply I believe in your mission." Silas looked at his brother, a confused and desperate question in his eyes. What was he doing? Was this a trick, a way to appease their father? Elias, however, was intrigued. "What is it?" he asked, a flicker of curiosity in his cold eyes. "What have you brought?" "It is in the barn," Thomas said. "In a locked trunk. It is a text, an old unholy text that I found in my studies. I believe it is a record of the very corruption you speak of. It is an unholy gospel that will prove to you, beyond a shadow of a doubt, that we are on the right path." A flicker of hesitation crossed Elias's face. He was a man obsessed with knowledge, with theological debate, and with the proof of his own righteousness. The prospect of a new, ancient text, a testament to his own divine foresight, was a powerful lure. "A record of the corruption?" Elias asked, his voice now a low, predatory purr. "Lead the way, Thomas." Thomas nodded, a small, almost imperceptible gesture to Silas. A signal. He was going to lead their father away to buy them time. "Go," Thomas mouthed to Silas as he turned to leave the study. "Get to the cellar. I'll get him out of the house. Meet me at the well behind the barn." Silas nodded, a silent promise. He watched as his father, the fanatic and the zealot, followed the golden sun out of the room and out of the house, a moth drawn to a flame. Silas didn't waste a moment. He crept back to the pantry, his heart pounding in his chest. The cellar door was open, and he descended into the cold, damp blackness. He fumbled in his pocket for the lantern and the matches, his hands shaking. He lit the wick, the small flame a beacon in the suffocating darkness. He made his way to the partition wall, his mind a mixture of fear and a grim resolve. He held the lantern up to the crack, and his blood ran cold. The cot was empty. The chains lay on the dirt floor, broken. The bucket was overturned. The boy was gone. A single horrifying thought screamed in his mind. They were already here. Someone else had been here. Someone had beaten them to it. He heard a low, scraping sound from the other side of the partition. Not a human sound, not a voice, just a scraping, rhythmic sound, as if something was being dragged. He held the lantern up to the wall again, his eyes wide with terror. He saw a shape, a long, dark shape, moving slowly across the floor. It was a spade and a shovel. The truth slammed into him with the force of a physical blow. The scraping sound was the shovel digging into the packed dirt floor. The cot was empty because the boy was not gone. He was being buried alive. Silas's stomach lurched, and he felt a wave of nausea so profound that he almost collapsed. He wasn't too late. He was just in time to witness the final horrible act. His parents, the sanctified Abernathys, were not just holding a boy in a cellar. They were executing him, burying him in a crude, unmarked grave on their own property, a final horrifying sacrifice to their twisted faith. He heard a soft click from behind him. He spun around, the light from the lantern illuminating the cellar stairs. Rebecca, his mother, was standing at the top of the stairs, a silent, grim guardian. The padlock, a new one, was now snapped shut on the cellar door. "You shouldn't have come down here, Silas," she said, her voice a flat, dead calm. "Now you are one of them, a part of the darkness." He was trapped in a tomb with his mother, who was now not just a silent observer but an accomplice. Trapped with a horrifying secret that was being buried alive, inch by terrifying inch. The story of the family who hid more than prayers was coming to a bloody and horrifying conclusion, and Silas was a prisoner in its final, dreadful chapter. The air in the cellar, already thick with the scent of damp earth and decay, now felt heavy with a palpable sense of dread. Silas stared up at his mother, a small, frail-looking woman who had, in that moment, transformed into a monstrous jailer. Her face was a mask of cold, unyielding piety, her eyes devoid of any emotion other than a grim, fanatical resolve. "Let me out, Mother," Silas said, his voice a low, urgent plea. "You have to let me out." She shook her head, a slow, deliberate movement. "I cannot. This is for your own good. You have been corrupted. You have seen the truth of the world, and you have chosen to deny it. You have chosen to side with the darkness." Silas looked back at the partition wall, his mind reeling. He could hear the sound of the shovel, a rhythmic thwump of dirt being moved. The burial was continuing. They were going to kill the boy. They were going to kill him, and then they would come for Silas. He had to act. He couldn't just stand there and plead. He held the lantern up, his eyes scanning the cellar for a way out. There was no other door, no window, nothing. The Abernathy cellar was a sealed tomb. "Mother, please," he said, trying a different tack. "What has happened to you?" The boy, he's just a child. What did he do? Rebecca's face softened slightly, a flicker of an old, deep-seated pain crossing her features. You don't understand, Silas. You don't know what they did to us. His family. They brought a plague. Not of the body, but of the soul. They came here to Harmony Creek and they brought a sickness with them. They poisoned the well, the very source of our life. And then they were gone, vanished into the night, leaving us with their sin. Silas felt a jolt of shock. The well. He had always heard the stories. The town's first families had spoken of a mysterious sickness that had afflicted the community a generation ago, a sickness that had left dozens of children with a strange, wasting illness. They had blamed it on bad water, on a poisoned well. Could that have been the truth? Or was this just another twisted justification for his parents' cruelty? His parents were not good people, Silas, Rebecca continued, her voice now a low, chilling confession. They were different. They worshipped a different God. They believed in a different truth, and they left their son behind, a living monument to their sin, a vessel of their unholy beliefs. Silas stared at her, the pieces of the puzzle beginning to fall into place, but the picture they were forming was more monstrous than he could have ever imagined. The Abernathys had not just been a pious family, they had been survivors of a terrible, unspoken trauma. A trauma that had warped them, twisted their faith into something unrecognizable. "So you took him?" Silas asked, his voice full of disbelief. "You took him and locked him down here?" "We had to," she said, her voice now a panicked whisper. "We had to contain the darkness. We had to save the town. We were the only ones who could. Your father, he saw the truth. He saw the evil that was still in the boy, in his blood, in his soul. He has to be cleansed. The evil has to be buried." The sound of the shovel stopped. Silas held his breath. A new sound emerged from behind the wall, the sound of a key in a lock, the padlock that held the partition door shut. He heard a click and then the creak of an old door swinging open. A figure emerged from the darkness behind the wall, a tall, gaunt man covered in dirt. It was Elias. His face was a grim mask of a righteous, exhausted purpose. He looked at Silas, at his mother, at the sealed cellar door. "It is done, my dear," Elias said, his voice a low, triumphant whisper. "The vessel has been cleansed. The evil has been returned to the earth from whence it came." Silas felt a wave of cold, hard fury wash over him, a rage so powerful it eclipsed his fear. They had done it. They had buried him. They had murdered a child. "You're a monster," Silas said, the words a raw, venomous hiss. "Both of you. You're murderers." A new sound came from the top of the stairs, the click of the padlock on the cellar door. He turned, his heart leaping into his throat. "I don't think so, Silas," a new voice said. It was Thomas. He was standing on the steps, holding a shotgun. His face was not the face of a grieving man. It was a face of cold, hard resolve. "I think you're the monster, and it's time you were put back where you belong." Silas's mind reeled. Thomas, his brother. He had handed him the keys, had pleaded with him, had trusted him, and Thomas had betrayed him. He had not gone to the barn to distract their father. He had gone to get a weapon. He was a part of this. He was in on it all along. He had lied to them, to both of them. "Thomas, no," Silas said, the words a desperate plea. "Oh yes, Silas," Thomas said, a cold, terrible smile on his face. "You see, Father and I, we have a plan. We always have. We knew one day you would find out. Your heart is too weak. You have always been too sentimental. You lack the conviction to do what is necessary for the greater good." He looked at Elias, at Rebecca. "The Abernathy family has a sacred duty," Thomas said, his voice a low, sanctimonious whisper. We have to protect this town. We have to keep the darkness from rising again, and we will do what we must to ensure our salvation. We will bury what needs to be buried, and we will keep a close eye on those who would try to unearth it. Silas stared at his brother, at the man he had just trusted, and he felt a cold, bitter wave of betrayal wash over him. The entire time, Thomas had been playing a game, a cruel and elaborate performance to trap them, to ensure that the terrible secret remained buried, along with the boy. The Abernathy family was not a family of faith. They were a family of fanatics, a bloodline of madness and cruelty, and Silas and Elara, their only hope for a different future, were now their prisoners. The silence that followed Thomas's confession was more terrifying than any scream. Silas stared at the shotgun in his brother's hands, at the cold, fanatical glint in his eyes, and a devastating truth settled over him. Thomas had not been broken by the secret. He had been fortified by it. His sorrow in the study had not been for the boy, but for the weakness he had to feign in order to lure Silas into the trap. The gold had always been a veneer, and now the iron beneath was revealed. "What about Elara?" Silas asked, his voice a low, desperate plea. "Where is she?" "She is where she belongs," Elias said, his voice a low, rumbling threat. "Locked in her room. We will deal with her later. Her soul, though fragile, can still be salvaged, unlike yours." Silas's stomach twisted. Elara. He had sent her away, had told her to hide. He had thought he was protecting her, but he had just made her an easier target. "You can't do this," Silas said, his voice rising in a frantic protest. "You can't just kill a child and then lock us away. Someone will notice. Someone will find out." A cruel, terrible smile spread across Elias's face. "The world believes what it is told, Silas. We will tell them you and Elara had an argument, a terrible fit of madness. We will tell them you've run away and that we, in our grief, have chosen to honor your memory by moving on. The town will believe us. They always have." He looked at Thomas. "Bring him up," he commanded. "We will have a talk, a final conversation. It is time we explain to you the true cost of your conviction." Thomas descended the stairs, the shotgun held steady in his hands. Silas didn't fight him. What was the point? He was trapped. He was a prisoner in his own home, in a family of monsters who had not just buried a boy, but had also buried their own humanity. They dragged him upstairs, through the silent, oppressive house, and into the sitting room. Rebecca lit a few lanterns, and in the golden light, their faces looked like painted masks of a perfect, unyielding righteousness. Elias sat in his favorite chair, his hands clasped over a large leather-bound Bible. Thomas stood at the door, the shotgun resting against his shoulder. "Sit," Elias commanded, gesturing to a chair opposite him. Silas sat, his body a coiled spring of tension. He looked around the room, at the familiar furniture, at the framed family portraits on the walls. In one of them, a younger Silas and Thomas stood with their parents, their smiles wide and innocent, their lives not yet touched by the horror that lay beneath their feet. "You see, Silas," Elias began, his voice a quiet, measured sermon. "When the boy's family came to town, they brought with them a sickness, a corruption of the soul. They were not sick in the body, but in the mind. They were a family of witches. They practiced dark arts. They spoke in tongues and they wrote in symbols." Silas listened, his mind trying to make sense of the new information. "Witches? That's insane, Father." "It is not insane," Rebecca said, her voice a sharp, cutting whisper. "It is the truth. They poisoned the well, not with a poison of the body, but a poison of the spirit. They left us with a darkness in our hearts, a darkness that grew and festered. Your sister Elara was born a few months after they left, and she was different. Not sick in the way the other children were, but different. She was too quiet, too fearful, We knew the darkness had found a vessel in our own blood. Silas stared at his mother, his mind racing. They thought Elara was possessed. They thought she was a vessel. This was a level of madness that was beyond his comprehension. And then, Elias continued, his voice a low, hypnotic drone. One day, 4 years ago, we found him, the boy. He was a small, lost thing, a stray from that dark family. We knew we had a choice. We could turn him loose and risk him infecting the town, or we could contain him. We could take on the burden ourselves. We chose the latter. We chose to protect our family and our community from the evil he carried. And we knew from the very beginning that we would have to bury that evil. We have known this day was coming. "So you've been waiting for this?" Silas asked, his voice filled with a terrible, bitter irony. "Waiting to kill him?" "We have been waiting to set a soul free," Thomas said, his voice flat, emotionless. "The boy was not a person, Silas. He was an entity, a host. And now, the host is gone. The corruption has been returned to the earth, where it can be cleansed by God's judgment." Silas looked at the three of them, at his father, his mother, and his brother, and he saw not just madmen, but something far more horrifying. He saw a family bound together by a shared delusion, a common crime. They were a sealed unit, a perfect, unyielding circle of madness that no one from the outside could ever hope to break. "And what about Elara?" Silas asked, a final, desperate thought. "Are you going to cleanse her too?" A terrible, heavy silence filled the room. Elias's eyes, cold and calculating, fell on Silas. "She is a problem," he said, the words a chilling pronouncement. "But we have time. We will watch her. We will pray for her. And if the darkness begins to take hold, we will do what we must." The meaning was clear. Elara was not safe. She was on a probationary period, a prisoner waiting for her final sentence. And Silas, he was the one who had seen too much. He was the one who had tried to expose them. He was a threat to their perfect, deranged world. "What are you going to do with me?" Silas asked, his voice trembling slightly, not from fear, but from a bone-deep sense of despair. "We have a plan," Elias said, a cruel smile on his lips. "A plan that will not only remove you from our lives, but will also serve as a warning to anyone who would dare question our faith. A warning that the Abernathy family is not to be trifled with." Silas looked at his brother, at the man who had pretended to be an ally, at the man who had just handed him over to their own family's madness. And in that moment, he knew there was no escape. His brother's salvation was not for them. It was for the Abernathy name, for the family's legacy of lies, and for a secret that was now buried not just in the ground, but in the heart of a fanatic. The night dragged on, Silas held captive in the sitting room, Thomas's shotgun a constant threat. Escape was futile. The house was a fortress, his family its unyielding wardens. Elias and Rebecca whispered, their disjointed conversation revealing the depth of their madness. Silas was a new challenge, a wayward son to be corrected. "You will not speak to a soul, Silas," Elias declared, his voice a terrifying calm. "You'll be deemed ill, unhinged by fever. You will be seen, but unheard." Silas looked at Thomas, confirming his brother's cold, unyielding resolve. Thomas was a willing accomplice, not a victim. "Why, Thomas?" Silas whispered, a final, desperate question. Thomas remained a blank mask, a silent sentinel to their terrible secret. As dawn broke, Elias announced, "It is time. The town will be waking soon. We must begin." They led Silas into the yard. On a cart lay Elara, still and silent, eyes closed. Rebecca assured Silas she was merely sleeping, given medicine to calm her. They had drugged her, stolen her voice. Silas was then led to a hidden, derelict shed. Elias unlocked it, revealing a dark, damp room with a cot and a heavy chain. "Your new home, Silas," Elias said, a cruel, triumphant smile on his lips. "A place to find salvation, to atone for your sins." They wouldn't kill him. They would imprison him, a living ghost. Thomas, without remorse, offered Silas a chilling choice. "Come in willingly and live, or fight, and we will simply say you ran away. You will be a memory." Silas knew they spoke the truth. He walked into the shed. The locks click, a damning verdict. Days turned into weeks. Silas, isolated, lost track of time, sustained by meager meals. He heard footsteps, but saw no faces. One day, the sound of a wagon approached. It was Sheriff Jedediah Cross. Silas pounded on the door, screaming for help. The sheriff's voice, muffled, spoke to someone. Then Elias's calm, sanctimonious explanation cut through. "Just my poor son, Jedediah. He has been unhinged. We must keep him here for his own good." Silas heard the sheriff's sorrowful pity, then the wagon departing. He was not just a prisoner, but a madman in the town's eyes, a casualty of a war he hadn't known he was fighting. Weeks of torment passed. One evening, Silas heard the shed's lock being fumbled. "Silas," a terrified whisper. "It's me, Elara. I stole the key." Relief washed over him. She was alive, trying to save him. He warned her of the danger, but she insisted, "I can't leave you. I can't." The lock clicked, and Elara, gaunt and spectral in the moonlight, stood before him. "We have to run," she urged. They crept across the yard. Just as they neared the road, a light appeared in their parents' bedroom. "They're awake," Elara whispered. A low, rhythmic tolling began. The Abernathy bell, a generations-old call for family. Now, it was a call to arms. They ran, Elias's booming voice echoing behind them. "Stop, children. You cannot escape your destiny. You cannot run from your salvation." Then, a gunshot. Silas turned to see Elias, shotgun in hand, aiming not at them but into the distance. A cacophony of voices and footsteps rose from the darkness. The Abernathy bell was a town signal. "They are running," Elias roared. "The darkness has taken hold. We must cleanse them." The townsfolk of Harmony Creek emerged, grim faces illuminated by lanterns, pitchforks in hand. They were not there to help. "Silas Abernathy," Sheriff Cross boomed, his faith now a weapon. "You are possessed. Atone for your sins." Silas saw the terrifying certainty in their eyes. They believed his father. He looked at Thomas, standing in the road, a grim sentinel. This was Thomas's salvation, a public exorcism, a judgment that would brand Silas and Elara as something to be contained, cleansed, and ultimately buried. There was no escape. They were trapped in a town, a community, a world that had chosen to believe a lie. The Abernathy family would bury their own children as a final, horrifying sacrifice to a century-old deception.